Hi guys! I've got another layout and process video that features a design made with 6 by 6 inch papers. The main design of this layout is a large swirl pattern with lots of little arrow pieces cut out of several different pattern papers. One of the best things about 6 by 6 inch papers and their smaller size is that the patterns are also smaller and shrunken down, so you can get away with cutting tiny pieces like this and still seeing that pattern on the paper. Last month, the layout was super simple and came together very quickly, and this layout is the complete opposite of that. This was a challenge for sure, and definitely took some time, but I love creating designs with lots of details like this, especially with 6 by 6 inch papers. Using 6 by 6 inch papers always challenges me to come up with these larger designs made up of smaller pieces, and I have a lot of fun with that concept. This layout actually ended up being a roller coaster full of twists and turns and even a few loops. I actually had to start over at one point because my original idea was not coming together the way I intended. Long story short, for the first attempt at this design, I used a stencil for the background and I loved the look of it, but when I started adding the arrow pieces, it just looked like a big blob of nothing, really. Both the stencil design and the arrow swirl design just kind of meshed together without the ability to tell what was what. I think at one point in this video, you'll see the stencil design while I'm demonstrating something else, so you'll be able to kind of see what I'm talking about. I do really like the stencil design, so at least I can save it and use it down the road for something else. To start, I used my silhouette to cut out a swirl design to use as a template. I considered just winging it and hand drawing that swirl, but I know me and the perfectionist in me would have been twitching at uneven spacing or it being off center and not perfect circles. I'm kind of weird like that about certain little details. I laid the swirl cutout on top of my base paper and used a pencil to trace around the design. This is going to be both a guide for where to place my arrow pieces and a stitch design as well. I had to be really careful with this part because the swirl shifts quite easily as I trace around it. After I have the swirl traced, I go through and use an eraser to clean up the lines a little bit. This is eventually going to be a stitch line and I don't want any of those pencil marks peeking out. I wanted to have a messier look for this layout based on my photos and the boy theme. I actually don't have a video of this next step, and this is part of that roller coaster I was talking about. I realized after I was done, I had not hit record, so there's no footage to show you of this part, but it's super simple, so I don't think you'll miss anything. My photos have kind of a grungy black frame, so I wanted to add some paint splatter on the background to match that feel. I used black watercolor with very little water, so it's a bold black. I used a brush and flicked it all over the paper using that swirl traced on the paper to help me see where I wanted more of that splatter. After the paint dries, I can start adding my arrow pieces. There are 3 ways you can make these arrow pieces depending on the supplies and tools you have on hand. The first is by using an electronic die cutting machine like a Silhouette or a Cricut. This is by far the easiest. The second is to cut several strips of pattern paper and use the corner of a hexagon punch to make that arrow point. Then you slide the strip forward a little and punch again. This gives you a little arrow piece. The downfall to this one is that it's harder to end up with consistently sized arrow pieces. And the third option is to make a template strip with an arrow point and use it to draw the point along a strip of paper. Then you can use scissors to cut the pieces out. I think the easiest is to cut one side first and then cut down the other. This option is definitely the most time consuming. To begin, I started in the center and adhered my first arrow piece on that swirl design. I tried my best to line up the middle points of the arrow pieces with the line of the swirl. The pieces are small and there are so many, so I'm not too worried about perfection with placement as long as it's close. For the spacing, I just eyeballed and tried to stay consistent throughout the whole design. It's not perfect, but again, there are so many pieces in the whole design that imperfect spacing here and there isn't going to be a big eyesore or anything like that. To adhere the pieces, I used a small dot of liquid adhesive just to kind of tack it down. Since I'm adding stitching over these pieces, I don't need them to be super glued to the layout. When it came to picking out these papers, usually I use a single paper pad, but I didn't with this one. I couldn't really find a boyish looking collection with the colors I had in mind. So instead of using one paper pad, I pulled papers from several and came up with my own color combo. And I wish so badly there were more generic color options with boyish collections and paper pads. So this part of the layout took a lot of time. The part that slowed me down the most, especially towards the end of the swirl, is the liquid adhesive was getting all over my hands and nails, and it made my fingers sticky, which in turn made handling the small pieces a little more difficult. I tried using my tweezers, but I felt like that slowed me down even more. After the arrow pieces are added, I'm going to add the holes for stitching by placing my layout on a piece of foam and using a paper piercer to pierce holes along that penciled swirl design. There's enough showing of the line between the arrow pieces that it's quite easy to follow along the design. And I actually went a little out of order of how I would have usually done this. I always adhere my photos first before I pierce those holes just to cut down the time and not waste my time piercing or stitching in an area that isn't going to be covered anyway. But with this layout, it had taken so long to add all the little arrows. I think I was just ready to go and jumped in with the piercing without even thinking about adding my photos first. After the piercing is done, I go ahead and add my photos to the bottom left corner. To stitch the swirl design, I'm using 3 strands of black embroidery floss, and I start by anchoring it on the back side of the layout. Then I stitch through the pierced holes using a back stitch. If you are new to hand stitching and you want to learn how to do it, I have a video that I will link to in the description below that shows my process for hand stitching. With the stitching done, I can start adding all of the fun details. I created a title with a cluster of words and phrases. It says Drew and Jackson, you plus me, brothers, and know what I'm saying. It seems lately I've been doing more clusters of words and phrases for my title instead of one phrase. After my title, I added some stars and an arrow sticker. For the stars, I'm using a combination of star rings or frames, punch stars, and cork stars. To make the star rings or frames or whatever you want to call them, you just need 2 punches in 2 different sizes. You punch the small star first and then line up the larger star punch around the small punched out star on the paper, and then this gives you a little star ring. In the top right corner, I added my journaling and 2 wooden male figures. I used a big one and a little one to represent a big and little brother. To customize them a little, I added a D to the big one for Drew and a J to the little one for Jackson. Then to complete that corner, I added more of the stars and another arrow sticker. For my finishing touches, I always like to go in and add some really small detail to cluster designs. So I'm adding some teeny tiny stars. Some I've punched out of black cardstock and some are silver and from an embellishment pack. I also added a few more word stickers to the top corner. And my final finishing touch was to go in and add more watercolor. It's always hard to predict exactly where those splatters are going to go. So usually in the end, I'll come in with a brush and finish out the look and add more where I feel like there needs to be more. So that's all for this layout. This was definitely one of the more complicated designs I've made. And not because the concept was necessarily complicated, it was just time consuming. More so than I was expecting. If you want to replicate this design, you could simplify it by using a swirl with larger spacing between each line and using larger arrow pieces. If you enjoy using 6x6" paper pads, I have tons of sketches that focus on using 6x6" papers, and I promise they are not complicated like this layout. Most are very easy to use. The biggest bonus of using both 6x6" paper pads and sketches together is that you are going to be creating layouts super fast. Both can be a great way to help you save time, and I'll link to those sketches down below. If you are looking for a place to buy and stock up on 6x6" paper pads, be sure to check out scrapbookgeneration.com. We have so many to choose from, and several from smaller companies that you've maybe not heard of. There are tons to look through. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.